So thank you, Deb and Kate, for spectacular talks. We're going to be starting a Q&A now. So wonderful. I see you, Kate, and Deb. Can you turn on your video? And can folks hear me? Kate and Deb, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Awesome. Okay. So to kick this off, we have some questions that we circulated amongst ourselves beforehand to prioritize a few. I did want to start with a question about kind of balance and motivation. I know that myself as a practitioner building algorithms, at various points in my path in this space, it's been really hard to like struggle with the hard questions about the work that we do. And I joke that when I read Automating Inequality, I had like a internal crisis for a few days. So I know that both of you do research. You also have very kind of operational viewpoints in terms of improving the technologies. So I did want to kind of surface what motivates your operational work and what do you see as kind of your hopes and optimism for actually improving the work that many people in the audience are doing?
You want to go first, Deb?
Yeah, so I guess the question is sort of what motivates our, I didn't quite understand sort of the main question. Are you asking what motivates
what makes you optimistic that that change is possible and to drive for change? Because one of the biggest critiques I see is that when you ask the hard questions of the technology, you can often be bucketed and you're just throwing stones at a glass house. But I really see both as trying to span into more of the details of how these things are built and governed.
Yeah, I definitely think that change is very possible. Like I mentioned many times that I'm in this space because I'm optimistic that there are genuinely sort of productive things that we can do with this technology. But it's sort of the same thing as, you know, the examples I've been giving with respect to engineering responsibility. I just think that because of a combination of the lack of regulation and the very you know, hyped narrative that's out there in the public right now, the high expectations that the public has for this technology, you end up with a lot of misrepresentation of what these models can actually do and overpromising. And as a result of that, you know, when these models end up failing, it feels as if, you know, we aren't as a community sort of like working quickly enough to develop things that work to the expectation of what the public is anticipating. But in reality, I think it's going to help a lot to yeah, definitely slow things down and focus on operational details, but also be really careful about the kind of narratives we share with the public and the expectations that we set around the technology. I think there's a more sort of well-scoped conversation and set of promises that we can deliver on that people just don't like to talk about because it's not as exciting. But that's really where a lot of the progress I see being made. And with respect to, you know, actually getting these companies to make improvements. So when we conduct an audit, we do that with the expectation of, you know, updating corporate behavior or updating the regulation guiding corporate behavior. And the reason that we have that expectation that, you know, we can build technology that also works for people of color, you know, for example, is because I think there's a couple things. One is that, you know, we know that there are differences, but they're not insurmountable differences. You know, I think that especially as people of color, it's easier to sort of understand and just appreciate the humanity of other people of color. And that's something that I think convinces us immediately that, you know, a lot of the technology that is failing for people of color is just, those failures are sort of prompted by a negligence or a lack of care or concern for that community rather than this sort of like technological limitation that it sometimes gets presented as. And then I think the other aspect of it as well is that the communities of color sort of have that expectation that you know, you can't say a technology works. The slide kind of flew by in the edited video, but you can't say a technology works unless it works for everyone, in the sense that you really can't claim to have solved a problem unless that problem is solved for minority populations as well. And I think that that gives us the expectation that if companies can be motivated to make their technology work for the majority population, or the sort of the communities that they've chosen to prioritize, then if properly incentivized or regulated, then they will also have that motivation to make it work for everyone, i.e. also those marginalized or under considered groups as well. And that's what we saw with facial recognition. Once these companies were sort of called out for their failures, and the public made it very clear that it was unacceptable that they were failing on a specific segment of the population, that was more than enough incentive for them to get to work and to prioritize this as a concern, and to address these issues. So I think the capacity to get there is it's definitely a possibility for us to do better. And it's actually interesting because it is those marginalized groups that are critiquing the situation that are the ones that have the sort of most hope that we can do better and are really the motivating factor for the field as a whole doing better, rather than settling for these false narratives of where we're at now and being sort of complacent with where we're at now, which is definitely not good enough. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I guess I'll just add that what gives me hope is that I feel like as a entire health and medicine community, we have really evolved a lot from, with inspiration from the Black Lives Matter movement over the past year and a half, from recognition during the pandemic that we were all very much interconnected in ways that we had not all fully acknowledged before. And, when I was on the job market about a decade ago, preaching this research and saying this is what I want to do and this is what I want to commit to, I had to spend all of my time convincing people that it mattered, convincing people that this was actually a problem. That was my big challenge. And now we're really all more in a space, Deb and I are here talking to you guys, right? We're more in a space where people are like, yes, we know that this matters, but what the heck do we do? And so that's at least an advancement in the past decade, a big one. And then the other thing that I think gives me a lot of hope is this acknowledgement, as I mentioned through the pandemic, that to better the technology, just as Deb said, is better for everyone, right? If the technology doesn't work for some communities, the technology doesn't work. And sort of the inverse is true, is that if if advances only apply to some communities, then we are not all going to be as good as we could be, right? And I think that I mentioned this really briefly in my talk, but I think that ancestral diversity in databanks is a really good example of this, because that we know that a large portion of genetic diversity is actually in people of African descent. It's not in white people. And so even though across the board, the genetic wide association studies databanks have only about 4% of people with African descent, those 4% are associated actually with 7.5% of the genetic diversity in that data bank. And so that helps everybody. That floats all boats. And so certainly I think our appeal to equity has gained a lot of ground, which is excellent. People should want to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. But I also think that several things have happened recently that really make us all aware that actually it's better for everybody to have a more just society.
Wonderful. Thank you both. So the first question I want to dig into is the role of science journalism and what I view as the court of public opinion, because I think both of your talks talk about limitations in current regulatory frameworks and the fact that a lot of accountability ends up happening in the court of public opinion. So Kate, you gave a shout out to Casey Ross and the STAT team. I know that one of our community members at MLHC who's watching is Karandeep Singh, who's also led to quite a bit of court of public opinion debate about technologies in this space. And I would say as a practitioner, I never thought that the role of STAT, MIT Tech Review, Wired would be so prominent. And I think you really saw that this last year, not just with healthcare, but across sectors. And we're also living in tremendous misinformation. And so these debates are happening in spaces where this previously may not have been where debates about technologies were happening. So I'm curious to get both of your perspectives on what do you see as the role of science journalism? Where do you think we are most in need of collaborations, and where do you think there's some responsibility being put on that community that needs to be elsewhere?
Yeah, I definitely learned a lot about sort of the value of press and sort of public conversation, and it's a very integral part of what it means to address that public pressure point I had mentioned around audits, where in the past people would conduct these very important audits, and if it wasn't sort of designed to garner the attention. Let's say the targets were anonymized or something, so the press would not write about it. As a result of it, the story might not travel far, and they might not actually get the companies to make the changes that they needed to make. So we understood pretty early on that press would be an important part of generating public attention and pressure. I think once that press arrived, we recognized the realities of just how tricky it is to manage that. The PR of a scientific result is like incredibly difficult to manage the narrative of how that evolves. On one hand, I guess I can mention a couple pros and cons. On one definite pro that I can see of scientific journalism's interest in this topic of algorithmic bias and algorithmic harm and auditing and some of these issues around data diversity is that the public is a lot more literate about these issues, and we have some really interesting moments in the last couple years of genuine public resistance to systems that did not serve a particular underrepresented group, and that group finally kind of had the vocabulary to really articulate the issue and push back. So one instance I'm thinking of is the situation where because of COVID, final exams were canceled throughout the UK, and there were various instances of the final results being determined or adjusted by an algorithm in order to determine the outcomes of A levels, for example. And it was really fascinating for me to see, students that had sort of read stories about algorithmic bias being able to, organize protests and push back against that algorithmic result, and having some level of language around, the discrimination that they experienced and tying it to that algorithmic decision making, and understanding that there's potential for that bias to contribute to their outcome. And then, I mentioned this in my talk, but it's a very similar situation with the Stanford residence students, right? Like they understood that there's that potential for bias. And that's not something that a couple years ago people were aware of as a general issue, and people had vocabulary to even organize around. So I think the press is really responsible for that public awareness, and thus a huge contributing factor to the fact that we're seeing protests being organized about this now. And now there's a lot of housing organizers that are protesting sort of the bias and tenant screening, automated tenant screening tools. And it's just, it's fascinating to me because, I remember when I was trying to raise these issues similar to what Kayte mentioned, people just did not see it as a problem. They did not understand the idea that, yeah, like this could be an issue, So now we're at a point where I think a lot of people are finally settled into the fact that it's a problem if a system is, built on data that isn't fully representative, or if it's making decisions that are disadvantaging a particular group. Like that's an issue. And I think that because of that, we're seeing all of this public awareness as well, and so much organization happening, which is really cool to see. And because of these refusals, that's how you end up with the recalls, like I mentioned, of people actually removing some of these problematic algorithms from deployment, which I think is a really fantastic outcome. The other sort of pro to press on this has been it's been really interesting to see the effect on policymakers. So I think policymakers pay a lot of attention to press, to public press. Perhaps they should not, perhaps they should also read more papers, but they really, depend on these public conversations to direct their agenda. And I think it's been really fascinating to see how policymakers are influenced by media narratives. And then this kind of leads to the con, which is that that kind of puts even more responsibility on those that have this opportunity to play a critical role in science communication, to do that responsibly and to do that with, you know, a certain amount of attention to the details that they share and how they present certain narratives so that it's faithful to the actual result and they're not feeding into these hype machines. Because, you know, you do have policymakers that are highly reliant on these public sources, and you do have the public that's getting their main perceptions of these things from the media. So it's been really, you know, there's pros and there's cons. There's that responsibility, which is not always adhered to. Like we all kind of have read those stories of, you know, AI taking over the world, and you know, also stories of sort of exaggerating claims around you know, what companies can do with this technology, and that feeding into the premature deployment of some of these tools. Like, you know, there's the pros and the cons of having the press so intimately involved in the AI space. But hopefully, as researchers, you know, we can be also in the room with regulators, and we can also be there to sort of clarify which stories make sense and which don't. And then also we can hopefully also be engaged to some degree with those that are organizers and community organizers, and also helping them to understand, you know, what they should be paying attention to and what they should be avoiding. Something that I found to be really interesting, and this is something I learned through a colleague of mine at AI Now, Erin McIlroy, which works, they work a lot with sort of tenant organizers through the anti-eviction mapping project, was that community engagement is also as much about like mutual education, because we also have narratives that are told to us through the media about how tenant organizing works, for example. So as much as we're in the room with organizers to clarify details of how AI systems actually work and how algorithmic bias actually works, they can also clarify details that and clarify our own misconceptions through media of like how organizing works and how you know, a particular domain works. So that for me has sort of been the way to circumvent the media hype machine, has been to sort of use media as a starting point, but be present with stakeholders when it comes down to like figuring out the details that are really consequential.
Yeah, and so I guess I'll just add, so yes to everything Deb said. I'll add one point to her point about ensuring that media coverage is accurate. I do think that many of us in this space sort of have a moral obligation to pick up the phone when reporters call. I do it a lot, and I think in particular, white academics have a really high moral obligation to do this, because we are generally less burdened than our colleagues of color with service, you know, requirements anyway. And I spend a lot of my time on the phone with reporters trying to explain sort of these fundamental concepts, and that's what helps translate these things in a public fora. And I'll just make another point with academic journals as well, because I do think that those play an important role, and it's not just media, it's also academic journals, because academic journals can set standards that are not law, right? Academic journals can set all sorts of higher standards. You know, we saw that with not publishing the data about the atomic bomb, or not publishing data about how to make swine flu aerosolized. Like, academic journals can take a stand. And I've been increasingly asked by editors to review papers for data integrity. And I think that that's great. And I think we should continue to use journals also as a gatekeeper for saying, like, hey, if your data are dirty or you don't know where they came from. I mean, like, think about the New England Journal and the Lancet article, right? That both got retracted. Like, I will teach that for decades to come, because they didn't have access to the data, and the data were completely made up. And so I think that making that a part of peer review, and then potentially retracting articles that are disingenuous in their data collection, will be an important component, an important like stick moving forward.
So I will warn the audience that the questions, there's lots of questions coming in that are really complicated, and each question is touching on really complex things, so there may need to be some follow-up. I'll next go to data diversity, which there's an audience question I'll fold into something that we discussed previously. So both of you have talked about limited diversity in data sets. And I think, Kate, your associating it with COVID and grounding it, like COVID is where I really saw new dimensions of structural racism in healthcare and the systematic exclusion of people from services to even be able to have the opportunity to have data generated about diagnosis, about symptoms. So we know that there are limitations in data that is curated because the data generating process is the delivery of healthcare, which we know there's limitations. Deb, you talked about challenges when people try to resolve data, they just buy it. There's easy solutions, and it's easier to think about purchasing data than it is to think about what would it actually look like to expand access to healthcare and reform our payment system and our coverage system. Like, we've been working on that one for 50, 60 years. So I want to understand, and the audience question is about the GWAS and ancestral diversity versus racial identifiers. And what do you both see as within healthcare opportunities to address this problem? Because we do know, and a message you keep kind of honing in on, Deb, is that we have to know if these work for everybody. And we're not going to really be able to do that without the data needed to answer those questions.
Sorry, I was muted. I don't know if Kate, you have a immediate response to this, but I was gonna just mention. Okay, yeah, I was gonna just mention a couple things. There's a lot in there. I think there's one point you made sort of offhandedly, and in relation to like that audience comment of genetic diversity versus race versus all of these other things. Racial categories are not fixed. They are sort of, human invention for a lot of political and social reasons, and we are very careful about that at the Algorithmic Justice League. Joy is super, in particular, Joy Bulamwini, who sort of leads the Algorithmic Justice League, is super careful about how we have conversations about race. And in fact, our audit, Gender Shades and the Subsequent audits, were actually focused on skin type to say, we're looking at Fitzpatrick's skin type, we're looking at darker versus lighter, because, you can have someone that identifies as Black and have various, skin types, and you can have someone that identifies as white, and there's a lot of different there's a lot of messiness around using race and ethnicity in a way that's uncritical. So I just wanted to sort of point that out as a very valid point, that when you're auditing and you're assessing and you're looking at the sort of performance of a system with respect to different demographic categories, relying on phenotypic features versus sort of this cultural categorization of race is super, super important to consider and to do very explicitly. The other point I was going to make was, I guess there's two other points to make. One is that I actually think that, there's a lot of value in, and Kate kind of alluded to this in her last response around what journals need to do. There's a lot of value in just reporting, the diversity of the data set that you have, and the details of the demographics of the data sets that you're using, just to even articulate limitations and scope. Where, part of the challenge was that these companies were deploying these systems and then sort of claiming general use, when really it only worked for very specific subgroups and did not work for darker skinned women. And that's at the core of the issue, is that lack of communication and that misrepresentation of performance. Of course, it's horrible to release a product and say this only works for white men. No one else is going to benefit from this. But if you want to be able to make a different claim, then you need to evaluate your model on different populations. And I think that there's people bring up this structural issue all the time of, oh, well, because in the criminal justice system as well, the way that the data is set up is incredibly skewed in different ways. So people will say, oh, we don't have enough data for this, so we can't really evaluate for this. And it's like, okay, that's fair. Then you have to articulate the limitations of what your model has actually been tested for and the populations you can actually evaluate the system on. And if you have someone coming in that doesn't fit that majority profile or the profile that you've actually evaluated performance on, then you cannot use that system on that person. That person is sort of out of scope of what that system has been built for. So that's something that I try to communicate a lot as well, is that as much as it is about diversifying the data, it's also about being really clear about limitations. And then the second point I was going to make around how to go about that diversification, as with any data subjects, and I'm sure Kate has more to say about this, but it's important to treat that data subject with the dignity of the fact that it's a human being. You're collecting their data, but you're collecting the data of a human being, and there's a certain amount of care that you afford to that person. And part of what it means to care about that person is to engage in informed consent and to go through all of these processes of handling their data with a lot of respect. And we don't always see that with the Black community, even if their data is being sourced for the purpose of diversifying a data set to improve performance on that population. Yeah, there's examples from healthcare that I'm sure, Kayte even mentioned some in her sort of historical examples of that happening in healthcare, where the Black community now is sort of even hesitant to provide their data, just given the way it's been sort of forcefully taken disrespectfully in the past. And I think that is something that will probably persist as an issue, but it's important to, one, prioritize it. I don't think the default in a lot of mainstream computer, or I would say like a lot of mainstream tech companies, I spent some time working on an applied machine learning team and learned a lot through that experience about just the sort of typical machine learning engineering process. And as part of a lot of mainstream models, the way that the data is sourced is just through public media, public online media. They'll go through like the equivalent of a Google Images search and just look up certain concepts. And the way that media presents, I think this is something that's very easy for people of color to perceive and difficult sometimes for white people to see, but media is very skewed in terms of representation. I very rarely see myself in any movie or magazine or something like that. But that's the media that proliferates the internet. So that's actually the source for a lot of like commercial machine learning tools. And as a result, these data sets that we curate, even for research purposes, are very skewed because of the skew of the media. And it's been interesting because, even when I was on that team, we would always source our data from these, very public online spaces and not think twice. Like, it was just not encouraged to like critique or even assess or even understand the demographics of what came out. It was sort of taken as like, this is the natural sample of what it means, to have beautiful skin, for example, or even like a face or a hand, even though it was very heavily demographically skewed. And I think that just even beginning to question that and actively consider representation as part of what it means to accurately represent something has been a very important step for the field. Not taking that media default to be truth has been a very important step. I don't like if you Google beautiful skin or face or hand, and it's demographically skewed, understanding that the fact that it's all white faces or white hands is actually not the natural or like ground truth representation of what that concept means. And it took the field a really long time to get there. I think when I was interning, my manager was very much like, "What are you talking about? Is this even a problem? It's hard enough to get data. Like, why would we think about diversity?" But I think it's just kind of like actually correcting. People talk a lot about dirty data or corrupted data, where it's like, oh, this data doesn't actually represent the concept I'm trying to represent here. And we'll talk about it in the sense of, oh, X-rays, with a little patch of the make of the X-ray machine, like, oh, that was a mistake. Clearly there's that data was corrupted by the fact that we have the labels right in the image. But we don't talk about the fact that for a lot of mainstream data sets for, dermatology, it's all sort of on white skin. And that is actually also a corrupt sample where it does not represent sort of the full range of what you're going to see with every sample or diagnosis. So I think that like that is something that we need to start, that shift of thinking of like, oh, it's actually not correct to only see white samples. Like that's actually like a very skewed vision of the world that is corrupt in the same way that having X-ray samples from all the same machine is corrupt or incorrect. So yeah, just putting that out there. Yeah, go ahead.
Deb, I think one of the challenges, because the setting I work, we build things to integrate into our delivery setting. And so oftentimes the retrospective data may match the prospective data in terms of the demographics of individuals who access the system, but it does make a lot of assumptions around the corruption within the system that limits participation. So
yeah. Well, I think the other thing as well is that it's not about proportional representation. And people get confused about that sometimes with auditing, and that was an issue with facial recognition as well, where we're not necessarily saying that if 80% of your incoming patients are white, then you need to have a test set that's 80% white. It's important that if you have Black people that are going to be experiencing your product, you need to have a test set that has like an equal representation of Black people as white people, or even just like a disaggregated analysis that demonstrates that your product also works for this group. And that was something that we actually learned from our work, sort of reading about anti-discrimination law and how they sort of approached the analysis there. And it was really interesting because they were just like, yeah, it's not necessarily about proportional representation, but it's about saying that if this group is going to be impacted, then you just have to demonstrate that it works equally as well for this group as it does for other groups.
Yeah, and what I was going to add, Mark, to your original question about like many of these problems are fundamental to access to healthcare in our society. And I think a major challenge for all of us, both those in working in industry and those working in academia, is tackling centuries old issues is just not sexy, right? Like it's just, everybody wants to be like the next CRISPR person or like whatever it is. They want to be working on the hottest, latest technology and being like, hey, there's a history of racism in this country and a lack of access to healthcare. Like people are like, oh, that's what you do? Like, I get that. I don't want to hear more about that, right? And so, I mean, part of the challenge I think we have is to like bring the sexy back to like actually like some of these fundamental truths and fighting for that. And I think that that is something that we have worked towards in the past year. And also, I think sort of a reconceptualization, because even the bioethics of it has been historically focused on the appropriateness of expecting individuals to compromise some of their autonomy for the public good. Like that's been the rhetoric for a really long time, but it's a very white perspective, because actually when we actually ask people what they want, we find that our Black, African-American, and Latino participants are much more uncomfortable with the kinds of research and data sharing that we're doing now than our white participants. And when we're asking certain communities of people to compromise their autonomy at a different level than another community, then that's an equity issue, right? So it's no longer an individual autonomy versus community good. It's like a community equity issue, which I think is an important way to look at it. And then, sorry, one more thing about the race and ethnicity problem, because I think we have the problem on both ends and we haven't really talked about the other end. Like, so there's a lot of work going into increasing the racial and ethnic diversity into the input data, right, into the reference data, into the system. But then, so what if we end up with a racially and ethnically diverse data set? What the heck do we do with those variants moving forward, right? Like, do we say that a Black man with high cholesterol is at higher risk for having a heart attack and therefore should go on statins than a white man on the basis of like his self-identified race? And of course, we're using self-identified race as a proxy, not for genetic ancestry, but actually as a proxy for racism, right? So we're assuming that people have certain inequities and have faced certain challenges because of their self-identified race and ethnicity. And I think that this is, so I'm in OBGYN, and I think that this has played out a lot in the OBGYN context, where, you know, we assume that Black women are at higher risk for all sorts of things when they walk in to have their baby. And sometimes that's true, and we can really help people. And sometimes it's not true, and we don't allow women to have vaginal births after cesarean, or we put them into, you know, into surgery faster because we assume that they're faced with racism and inequities that they're not actually faced with, right? And so I think that it's a challenge both in an input and an application. And I just wanted to say that out loud too, because that's just as much of a problem.
In Kate, one just last reflection is, I think one of my biggest learnings from this last year with COVID, interacting with Black and Latinx communities, was the difference between privacy and safety. And for a lot of these communities, it wasn't so much that they prioritized privacy different than white colleagues, but it was that they did not feel safe and protected from these systems that would use data. So I would love to continue this and touch on complexities of the questions we have covered, questions we have in the queue. This unfortunately is time. So I need to hand it over to Clara. We're gonna be transitioning to breakout rooms for some breakout discussions. Thank you so much, Kate and Deb. It was a pleasure to have you. We'd love to keep you engaged in this community, and I'm sure folks will be following up with questions.
Thanks, everyone.